Welcome everyone to the Insightful Leader Live from Kellogg Insight featuring Ben Jones. I'm Jess Love, Editor-in-Chief of Kellogg Insight and the host of our podcast, The Insightful Leader. Thank you all for giving us an hour of your day today, and thanks especially to Professor Ben Jones for joining us. The Insightful Leader Live is a monthly series. So in January, we have another exciting guest lined up. We'll be hearing from Professor Steve Frankenary about how to design compelling visualizations that actually tell the story you want your data to tell. Today, of course, we'll be talking about all things innovation. But before we dive in, some housekeeping. Right now, everyone is telling us all the places they are in the world in the chat function, which is exciting. We are going to disable that soon. We're going to reserve that for any tech issues that come up. And so those are just going to head to us behind the scenes, and we can help you figure out what's going on. You'll also see a Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom, and that is going to be what we're going to use for any follow-up questions that you have for Professor Jones. If something is unclear, if there's a question that you'd really like us to get in sometime during the conversation, please use that Q&A and we'll be monitoring that. Last thing before we get started, we are recording this conversation and we'll send out a link to a video of this presentation after the fact. We'll also include some reference materials if there's anything you want to hear more about. So you don't have to worry too much about taking lots of notes. We will make sure you get this in your inbox soon. All right, let's get started. Professor Ben Jones is the Gunn Family Professor of Entrepreneurship, as well as a Professor of Strategy at Kellogg. He studies innovation, entrepreneurship, and scientific progress. And he looks at how all these things contribute to economic growth. His work in these areas has been published widely in the very top economics journals, as well as in general publications like Science, Nature, and Proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences. He's also an award-winning teacher, and he consults regularly with entrepreneurs and investors. So, if you are interested in learning more about the science of innovation and how we can see more of it as organizations, as teams, as societies, then he is exactly who you want to talk to.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. Very much looking forward to this wide-ranging conversation being with everyone here today.
So we are going to dive right in. Innovation. This is a really big, squishy, amorphous topic. And I think we all know what it means, but if you really press different people to define it, they would probably all define it slightly differently. So I just want to ask you how you approach this topic as a researcher. How do you go about actually, meaningfully exploring and then drawing meaningful conclusions about a topic this big and unwieldy?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jess. I think the word innovation and creativity, they can seem almost magical and seems like they might defy kind of systematic insight. And yet, the research community on these topics has been producing really a kind of rapid fire set of really interesting insights that are often quite surprising. And I think the reason that's been happening so much in the last 10 years and really right now is because of the big data revolution in some sense, the same kinds of things that are transforming, businesses in so many ways. We just have great data suddenly that we didn't have before. So we have data on every new business started in the United States in the last 10 years and every founder of all those businesses. We have data on every patent and all the inventors. We have data on every scientific article published around the world and all the scientists, all the funders. We have all of this information, and we're really just starting to unpack these boxes and really developing an exciting set of new insights. And I should forecast that pretty much everything I will say today, and that maybe if I don't give a caveat, is based on that kind of systematic evidence. So we really have a whole bunch of new facts that we can look at.
Interesting. So when you're talking about innovation, you're really talking about, a lot of different things in the context of different studies. So in some studies, you're talking about who's founding companies. In some studies, you're talking about who's coming up with the most meaningful or powerful patents that affect the most other projects. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're looking at kind of the inputs to innovation, and we're looking at what comes out and when you get great outputs and who and what was behind it.
So one of my favorite of your studies looks at kind of innovation at the level of the individual. What do we know about the kinds of people who innovate? And I'm thinking specifically about some of your work on who starts companies.
Right. So it's an exciting study for us. I've wanted to do it for a long time, but was only able to do it recently because the US Census provided a remarkable new data resource to my team, which was every company in the United States that was founded sort of since 2005. We can track the sales, we can track their number of employees, and we can look at who founded them, and we can connect back into other census data resources, including how old is the person, right? So I think an old and enduring question and understanding entrepreneurship. And I think something we ask ourselves is, am I ready to do this thing? Am I maybe too old to do this thing? And certainly, in the popular perception with regard to innovation and certainly with new ventures and entrepreneurship, people think it's really a very young person's game, right? They think that very young people seem to have some kind of systematic advantage. Maybe young people have more transformative types of thinking and are more creative. Maybe young people are better at deductive reasoning, like a good chess player, if you're watching the Queen's Gambit. Or, maybe you're just young and you have an incredible amount of energy and time because you're not encumbered by, having a family or a mortgage or other considerations. Maybe they're all in at young ages in a way that as you get further in life, it becomes more difficult to do. So, so that's a view. Is it true? So what we did is we got every new business in America and we looked at how old were the founders and what happened to the businesses. Were they successful? Were they have an IPO? Were they acquired? And just how do they grow? Do they reach kind of the highest echelons of new venture growth in terms of sales or employees that we see? And rather than me just tell you the answer to that question, I think we have a poll, and we can poll you on what ages people seem to produce as founders the highest growth companies in the United States. I think we'll conclude this poll in the next few seconds. So vote if you want to, just right away. Okay, here I am. I'm going to close the poll. Okay, so interestingly, the winner says the winning vote is between age 30 and 40. It's pretty even split though, right? In fact, if I had voted before I did the study, I also would have picked between age 30 and 40. I think in my head, it was probably 35. But what we find when you look at all the evidence is the answer is actually 45. So it's considerably older than many people think. And it suggests a very different view of, what is it that makes a great entrepreneur? It's not the 20-somethings, although that's such a common view. Not even the 30-somethings, it's somewhat older than that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Why do you think that is the case? You kind of presented the case for why you might think it would be somebody a bit younger, but clearly that is not what you found. Take us through why you think that is.
Well, I think the reasons that people think it's young people, there's some truth in those reasons. It's not that those are necessarily wrong, but it suggests that there's some other forces, something that you're accumulating as you get older that overwhelms those other forces potentially. And what do we accumulate? Well, among one thing we accumulate, of course, is human capital and experience about how to run a business, about knowing an industry. We also build our social networks, and we can build our own financial capital as well, which might be an important input into innovation. One of the kind of telling signals we see in this data, again, looking at all of it, gets at a related idea, which is the idea that you're supposed to, the transformative ideas come from outside the industry, right? People kind of come in and they disrupt, and you kind of want fresh thinking, outside the box thinking. And that kind of connects to that idea that very young people might be so innovative. But if you look at sort of where the high growth, these sort of 1 in 1,000 highest growth companies come from, they tend to come from people who have been working in the industry for a long time. So, the entire US economy is divided up into these very narrow industrial classifications and government statistics down to 6-digit levels. There's thousands of these, okay? It turns out that if you have worked in the exact same 6-digit industry code, just as a worker, in which you will start your business, your chances of a home run go up by a factor of 2 or 3. I mean, you're just much more likely to hit a home run. So I think there's some evidence, for example, along kind of the experience human capital channel that seems really, really important and valuable to being a successful founder.
This kind of reminds me of some of your work on innovation more broadly and how it is changing over time. Have you thought about, do you think that it's taking longer to become an entrepreneur than it used to because there's somehow more information that you need to know about different disciplines in order to then kind of make that next big advance?
Right. So if you want to kind of have a framework for thinking about this, one aspect is what I would call the burden of knowledge, which is just that to kind of get to the frontier in any area, we know so much more about everything, right? And that's part of the progress of the economy. And so to get to the frontier, there's kind of a deeper set of knowledge you might want to acquire that will make you better at taking the next step. Right. And so, with entrepreneurship, our data sets are really 21st century. They're very recent. If you look in that data, so we can't really say that there's a long-standing aging phenomenon because the data isn't there. But within the data we have, yes, the age is going up too. It's not just that it's 45, it's been rising slightly over the period we can observe. But if you look at other kinds of, creative, innovative data sets like Nobel Prize winning breakthroughs, which we can look at all of them, or you could look at all the great inventions since like 1900, which would be things like the light bulb early on, and then the MRI machine more recently. If you look at the ages of the individuals who make those breakthroughs, we see that's been going up a lot over time, going up by about 6 to 8 years over the last 100 years. So innovation not only is it sort of not a very young person's game in terms of the big ticket outcomes, it's increasingly not a young person's game. It's increasingly privileging those in middle age or beyond in terms of your likelihood of a great success.
Kind of an interesting follow-up question about, have you looked at all at co-founders? So people who are in maybe different age groups, maybe either in the context of science or the context of starting a company?
Yeah, so you can look at teams and you could sort of look at the founding team, if you will, say in all the new businesses in the United States. People kind of match a bit on age, maybe not surprisingly. Maybe our social networks keep us in sort of certain age groups. And so our co-founders tend to be fairly similar in age to us. There's an old idea in Silicon Valley, though, of so-called, adult supervision, which is the idea that you get this very young transformative thinker and, they have the creativity, but then you pair them with a seasoned executive. That would be sort of, Google, for example. Bringing in Eric Schmidt or something like that. But if you look in the data, that's just not the story that comes out. You can see some age range, but really the whole team is typically older. And it's not the case that the high growth firms have kind of the one young person and then a bunch of seasoned individuals. It's more that the whole team is considerably older.
Well, you mentioned Silicon Valley. I know you have talked about these results with some investors. Without going into crazy specifics, can you kind of talk about what was the response from some of the investors that you spoke with? Were they surprised by these results? Were they like, I'm investing in all the wrong companies, I should be doing something differently?
I was expecting a bunch of VCs that I know to basically maybe try to reject this. They say, oh, that can't be right. That's not consistent with our experience. And I actually got the exact opposite. Now, maybe people who disagree just didn't tell me. People are kind of polite, VCs aren't that polite, but people are broadly kind of polite. So maybe the people who disagree didn't tell me, but the people who commented to me generally said, that's actually very consistent with my experience. I've even had amusing situations where they've said that to me, kind of pulled me aside to say it because they didn't sort of want to say it in front of everybody else. But they would say then, that's, by the way, it's totally consistent. Or I even had the response once that, if I see another entrepreneur in a hoodie, I'm going to, something bad's going to happen. So there is a sense that this was consistent with actually more on the ground experience too. And in a sense, it has to be. Actually, this data set is so amazing. We looked at every founder and so we actually looked at Silicon Valley. We can look at an entrepreneurial hotbed and say, well, are the founders there younger that are successful? And the answer is no. In Silicon Valley, you still want to be older. You're more likely to be successful.
So age, and perhaps that's a proxy for experience or expertise in specific area. Is there anything else that you can tell us about individual success? What predicts a successful career trajectory, a successful company? Anything that you can tell us? I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, so I think it's a big area, a big open area. We have lots we can still do in the data that we have. So I'm gonna have to transfer away from sort of systematic evidence. But another interesting idea in innovation is about failure, right? And that's an interesting idea in society as a whole. Some people talk about the US entrepreneurship culture as kind of almost celebrating failure, or recognizing and being very permissive of failure. And that makes a lot of sense because most innovations fail. I mean, that's true at any of these, whether it's a new business, an invention, a scientific effort in a lab, in a research facility. Most attempts fail. And so you're going to fail all the time. And so you have to be permissive to that. On the other hand, you don't want to fail too much. There's a good piece of advice, which is it's great to fail, but just don't do it all the time. So at what point is that a good or a bad thing? And there's a lot of other evidence that suggests that, early success leads to future success, right? People sometimes call this the Matthew effect, which is kind of a rich get richer, poor get poorer phenomenon. But, you do well the first time, people believe you're good at it. So they give you more resources that helps you do well the second time. Whereas if you fail the first time, people are more skeptical of you and it gets harder to proceed. So we've done some studies that suggest that does happen, that sort of if you fail the first time, you tend to exit, you're more likely to exit. But we also see a very interesting countervailing force, which is that if you fail the first time and you choose to continue, so you're persistent and you show this key characteristic, what we could call grit, you actually become more likely to succeed than the people who succeeded at first. So to summarize that, there's this old Nietzsche quote, which is, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And there's really some evidence for that in research, certainly, where it might kill you. Failure does seem to take people out of the system. But conditional on being able to proceed, you seem to do a lot better, even than all the people who succeeded in the first round. So that's sort of a good news for failure in a sense, but it requires it requires grit. And of course, we tend to think more informally that is a key characteristic of innovators and certainly of entrepreneurs.
So I know that you're an economist, and economists love when everything is efficient and we are using resources the best way that we should. So knowing that it takes a certain amount of grit and persistence and a certain amount of expertise to kind of make it to the highest level of innovation, what more broadly do we do about this? Either from an organizational level or from a social level, what are we leaving on the table and how can we do things differently knowing this?
So I think we're leaving an enormous amount on the table and we're really underperforming as a society. And we'll come back to that because there's many dimensions to that underperformance. But just to follow the thread through here on age, for example, I mean, VCs might admit to me that this study is consistent with some of their own experience, but the reality is that VCs also bet young, right? And I think back to Peter Thiel's rather famous comment, we wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. And that's not to diminish Twitter and many innovations that come from young people. Many of them are extremely valuable, and some of them are indeed transformative. But they're lower probability. It's people later in life who have more expertise, whether it's market knowledge or more deeper scientific and technical knowledge. And if we're rotating early stage financing away from those people because of this popular bias towards the young, what are we not getting, right? I mean, you think about, we wanted flying cars, we also want solutions to cancer. We want solutions to climate change in whatever form that might take. We want solutions to global pandemics. We need people who are deep in biotechnology, in energy, in mechanical engineering, and infectious disease. These are real areas of expertise. We need to be rotating funding in that direction. And I think, we're also probably not serving even just at a consumer level. Most people are older. A lot of spending power comes from older people. A lot of people are retired and they have a lot of challenges, problems to solve at much greater ages. And are we not innovating for them, right? And what kinds of things are we doing that's so biased towards a digital media or something in young people that we're just misdirecting our resources away from what really are probably much bigger social problems and really opportunities for us to advance our standards of living.
So given how much we're leaving on the table, have you thought about the role of maybe government policies to change the incentives and make sure that we are, using the resources we have more wisely?
Right. So let me comment on that, and then actually we can launch another poll, I think. Um, the government does a lot. So you might look at what we do and think, oh, we do so much, right? So you would say Silicon Valley, it seems very impressive. And let's go to the government. I know on the basic research side, where the government plays especially leadership roles, we have things like the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. We have this big university system, and people in the U.S. win a lot of Nobel Prizes. And it looks really productive, right? There's a lot of stuff going on, and there's many ways that the government also is trying to facilitate private sector innovation. That's through things like the R&E tax credit, which businesses can take for doing research and development spending, and there are other things, as many other things. So it looks like we do a lot, but do we do enough? I mean, compared to what exactly? If you actually look over time, the federal R&D spending as a share of GDP has been declining dramatically. All told, public sector and private sector together, all told is about 2.7% of the entire GDP of the United States economy. Yet, economists strongly believe that spending is the key driver of growth, right? So what improves our health? What improves our longevity? What improves our standards of living? If we have the same set of knowledge all the time, we'll be where we are. We'll kind of be as we are. We'll sort of have the same per capita income. We'll live the same number of years and days on average. If you want to do better, you have to innovate. And yet we spend 2.7% of GDP. That seems kind of like a small spend, if you will, as an input into the thing that's going to drive all of these increases in standards of living. But that's not enough, because you might say, well, sure, but maybe most of that money is wasted. Like, is 2.7, but maybe we're just spending a lot of R&D dollars and most things fail. And as I said before, and maybe the return to a dollar we spend, maybe innovation is really hard. So we spend a dollar, but maybe it doesn't return very much. Maybe it's just a waste of money. So really to understand whether we as a society, and particularly whether as a government, we should spend more and facilitate more R&D, we want to think about what is the return on the dollars we spend. Like, are they paying for themselves? Are they paying for less than themselves? Is there a lot of opportunity being left on the table that we're just not seizing? So we have another poll, I think poll 2, which can get your views on sort of what do you think the social return is? And so what is the social benefit that's provided in some dollar terms for every dollar we spend on R&D investment? Okay, I think we've got the voters in the majority. Let's close this down. So number one answer is sort of $3 of social benefit for a $1 spent, which would still be a pretty good return, right? For every dollar, if you get an investment where I can spend the dollar, you give me $3 back in present value terms. I think we'd all take that. And then it's kind of more balanced, with some people going much higher. So this is, as you can imagine, like, how do you even answer this question? I'm not going to divert us into methodology. This is a paper I recently produced with Larry Summers, trying a new method. But this is not surprisingly a question many researchers try to answer, because we think innovation is so important to growth. Economists have been studying this for a long time. But our method we think is better and kind of gives a more holistic answer. And the answer it produces is at least 5 or 10. So a conservative answer based on our method is 5. And I would say it's probably much higher than that, more like 10 or even beyond. Okay. And so that suggests that we're just doing so little. And what's the intuition for that? It's that 2.7% of GDP is just not a lot of cost, and it's producing like massive expansions and growth over long periods of time. And so just the value of all that advance in productivity and health is just huge. So it just seems small. So in other words, we should do far more. So we seem like we do a lot, but when you think about it, we actually do very little. We could be having much faster rising standards of living, much longer lives. We should be living longer already today if we'd done more in the past. We would have higher per capita income today if we'd done more in the past. And we're just leaving enormous opportunities on the table.
We had a clarification question about how to kind of define the economic benefit to society. Can you just kind of walk us through a little bit of that? That's a really surprising number. I mean, that's
right, it's a big number. So briefly, if we don't innovate, our per capita income is the same, stays the same. We have no new knowledge. If we innovate, our per capita income might go up. So just think, how much does our per capita income go up every year based on the innovation we already do? And the answer is it goes up by about, $10 in value compared to the dollar we spend. That's the simplest way to think about it. And you can do a lot complicated. You can bring in health and how long we live and make all sorts of adjustments. And this analysis we did is trying to bring it all together and do it a lot of different ways. And you basically just can't get a number less than 5. That's sort of the main conclusion. And it could be a lot higher than that.
So what kinds of specific policies would you like to see more of? What could we do to kind of improve the incentives for innovation and R&D spending in the private sector, as well as the public innovation that you would like to see promoted?
That's a great question, of course. And there's a number of policies. Let me just give you a couple. We think that the returns to basic research look very, very high in some narrower studies, particularly say when the NIH spends money of a certain amount, eventually you see drugs that come out of it. mRNA and vaccines from Moderna would be a good current example that have enormous social value. And so, again, you're going to fail most of the time. But the point is, you keep advancing and you're willing to embrace that failure because what you unlock, Vannevar Bush, a sort of famous World War II era science leader, he led the US's science effort in World War II. It was very essential to winning the war. He described basic research as the fund from which future practical applications can be drawn. So that's important. And markets are very bad at basic research because it's exactly the point that you're doing new understandings and they don't have a commercial payoff immediately. It's going to take a lot of further effort to create the commercial payoff. And so markets are going to be very bad at that. So this is why you want things like the NIH and universities doing that. But in the private sector too, I mean, the evidence around, say, the R&D tax credit, there's very nice studies that suggest that a little bit more generous R&D tax credit creates a lot more private sector innovation. And that's very valuable and very direct and current and immediate as well. There are other forms of federal funding for entrepreneurship, or, for example, the SBIR grants, which try to connect basic research more directly into new venture creation in the economy. Those also show seemingly extremely high returns using pretty careful studies. So there's a number of things that are only consistent with the bigger picture, saying that we're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table, but tell us very specific things we could be doing that we're not.
So you brought up the vaccine program. I think the COVID-19 has been a test for the nation and for innovation on a lot of levels. And I think, the pandemic has spurred some pretty impressive innovations, like the Moderna vaccine. And this was designed, it's been manufactured in record time. What do you think about all of the innovation that you've seen in response to COVID-19? I know there's also been a huge shift in the research that people are, like now there's lots more researchers who are studying something related to coronavirus. Are you excited by the level of innovation that you're seeing? Or do you still think, we're not meeting the moment with enough innovation?
Another great question. And my answer is really similar. I'm very impressed that we have these 2 vaccines in record time, maybe 3, and that's great compared to not having them. But could we have done better? Well, it's a multi-layered question. But again, just think about the social cost that is borne every day in this country and around the world by not having a solution of a vaccine or not having one yet in your arm, or other things that could treat it, other kinds of innovations that could limit the cost of the pandemic. The GDP loss in the spring in the US alone was $15 billion a day. Today, it might be $5 billion a day, okay? Operation Warp Speed was $15 billion so far. That's one day's GDP loss. In other words, if you could spend another $15 billion and you could bring the solution one day forward in time, that would have paid for itself. Okay, so in a sense, it's great that we're doing this, but it's very, what we've spent is tiny compared to the cost we're bearing every day. And I'm not even including the death cost, which is enormous, but harder to measure. And then, if you compare it to, $15 billion, for innovation, there's money for innovation. Look at the $3 trillion the US government has already spent. It's about to spend another billion perhaps on the symptoms of the crisis, right? The PPP program, which helped a lot of businesses with maybe $600 billion, that's dwarfing our efforts at the solution, which is treatments and vaccines, testing, all of those things. And so, in my view, it's that the social returns are obvious that because, a one day forward solution will pay for itself many times over. We really spent very, very little compared to the problem. The question then is, if we did spend more, who could do it? Do we have enough talent? Do we have enough people in place who can actually do meaningful work? Which is a somewhat trickier question, but I believe the answer to that is also yes, which we could talk about if you'd like.
Let's talk about it. What do you, I don't think there's anybody who doesn't, at least on some level, think about COVID-19 and want to see this thing resolve as quickly as possible. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I think there are going to be a lot of people who are further from kind of the expertise you need, say on coronaviruses and infectious disease and vaccine development. But there are many other solutions that you could also be thinking about, from data-driven solutions to new work. Zoom is an important, it doesn't solve the problem, but it's very useful. We're using it right now. There's many other kinds of innovations that could have been very high return that we're maybe not investing in. So I think the question is, at some level, is there enough human capital or enough people with expertise around who can pivot into it? And so the studies that have been done, have shown that there's been a lot of people left on the sidelines, right? So for example, the NIH and the NSF came up with new funding to help people kind of pivot into this kind of research, but it came way too late, and it didn't really bring in new people. A lot of labs were shut down. Here's a perspective, right? I mean, so, we treat essential workers are clearly doctors and nurses and things and others. Those are clearly essential workers. But if the solution is going to come from biomedical researchers, aren't they essential workers too? And yet many universities and other research labs felt like they should shut down for various reasons, and they weren't getting the resources they need. So I think there were many, many things we could have been doing to extend our effort. But it also goes back to the deeper point, which is, you don't know when a pandemic's going to come. We need more people around who are ready to go. And our whole footprint in science is just too small. And even ignoring the pandemic, we wanted, as I said before, we want to bring much more science and innovation because it's going to pay for itself in ordinary times because it's a high social return. That's also going to pay off in a pandemic because you have that many more, virus researchers who can in fact jump in and bring those solutions forward in time.
What's heartened you about the response? Because there really has also been a lot of innovation. I know that there's been talk about just increased teamwork, increased transparency for data sharing. Is this something that you've been seeing too from your purview?
Absolutely. I mean, I know lots of people who have pivoted into COVID research. I've done it too with a few papers. Now, I'm not going to come up with a vaccine. That's so far from my expertise, but hopefully coming up with other insights about the policy process that can, create more funding or help accelerate our efforts in a more meaningful way. I'm doing a paper on it right now, which is looking at everyone. We have, again, every scientific article, we have all the patents, we have all the policy documents written about COVID. We're doing all these big data studies. It does seem that people who pivot from far away, doesn't go as well in terms of the impact. It's like we're just kind of, we're kind of going outside our own expertise, and not surprisingly, our impact is going to be low and maybe even incorrect, which is riskier. But I think, the more heartening thing is you've just seen so many people pivoting, right? I mean, I've seen people pivoting in all sorts of research areas just because people want to help. People, what can I do? I'm just going to suspend everything else I'm doing, and I'm really going to try to do whatever I can. And I think it's recognizing just how important the social benefit will be of any new insights that can be helpful. I think that is very heartening. I think the scientists and the innovators and the new venture people, I think everyone's willing. And then the question is, how do we create the system that allows them to succeed as quickly as possible?
So what is kind of interesting about your work is it sort of walks the line between looking at innovation and also looking at public policy and sort of where they intersect. So I wanted to talk about a few of the other policies that I know you've thought a lot about. A big hot button one is immigration. And I know you have done some research looking at the net effect of immigration to the US on innovation. And can you lead us through some of that research, a little bit about how you did it and what you found?
Sure, I'm very happy to, and that's a study that's really just come out. Right, so the common narrative economically about immigration is that immigrants come to your economy and they take jobs. Right? They're going to compete with those workers who are already there for certain jobs, and that's going to make the workers, say the U.S.-born workers in this case, worse off. Right, so immigrants might be good for the economy in some way, but they're sort of bad for workers, and that reasoning is a major sort of pillar of those who argue in a political system, against immigration. There are other reasons as well. So, but we're talking about innovation. So if you have your innovation hat on and you hear the word immigrant, you think, oh, Silicon Valley, someone is starting a company. You think Sergey Brin and Google. You think Elon Musk and Tesla. People who are born outside the U.S. come here and seem to start, very important leading companies that do what? They employ enormous numbers of people. So from a entrepreneurship perspective, at least, you begin to say, well, maybe, immigrants, yeah, sure, they might come and some compete for jobs and take jobs, but others come and start companies and they actually create jobs. So what's sort of the net effect? I mean, what do immigrants do sort of on average, and therefore what actually happens to workers in the U.S. economy? Maybe there's more demand for them because these immigrants come and create many employment opportunities. So to answer that question, we went back to our census data where we had, again, every new venture in the United States. We also looked at the Fortune 500 historically and a bunch of other things, but we were able to say for every founder of every firm in the United States, are you foreign born or are you US born? So we can code you as an immigrant or not. And then actually we have the W-2, these are amazing data sets, but we have the W-2 records of everybody in the United States. And so we have all workers in the formal economy, and we know if they are in fact US born or foreign born. So we can see immigrants coming into the workforce, kind of working for a wage, and we can also see immigrants coming in, founding companies, and then employing people. And you can ask the very simple question in that data, are immigrant founders employing more people than immigrants take jobs, existing jobs in the economy, right? So is there more of a, we created jobs, or is it more that we take jobs, looking at both sides? And if you do that, the really striking finding is that immigrants are extraordinarily entrepreneurial. They're more likely to start companies than US-born individuals, and then they tend to start companies of all sizes, including very, very big ones. And so the net effect is they actually create more jobs per immigrant in the workforce than compared to US-born founders and workers. So basically their net effect is on net. I mean, they do both. They create jobs and they take jobs, but on net, immigrants create jobs. And that means that the usual narrative is sort of exactly backwards. If you think about it in terms of job prospects for Americans, immigration on net is improving job prospects, not worsening them.
I know another policy that you've thought about is education. Obviously, if you talk about leaving things on the table, I think a lot of people would agree that we are maybe not doing as well as we can with educating, particularly in K-12. Do you feel like we're investing enough resources? Is there anything that you would like to see different? How do we kind of prepare the next generation of innovators?
Right, so that's a really important question. I think just to nest that with immigration, what are we talking about? In the prior conversation, if you want to scale up innovation effort in the economy, you need more people to work in innovative careers, to be STEM workers or innovative workers. And so where are those people going to come from? Maybe you think there's only so much talent, right? And so, if we could spend more money, but there's really no more people to draw in. The people who want to be innovators are already there. With immigrants, there's a large pool of people who want to come and be innovators, and we just decide not to let them into the country. That's sort of one way to, you could extend the human capital for innovation, but we don't do as much as we could. The second, though, of course, is you build your own human capital through the education system. And of course, you might do that with a PhD or a master's degree or a STEM degree as a computer science in university. But of course, it also goes right back to the beginning and who's on the pipeline towards those careers. And this is not my own work, but there's other big data studies looking at that. And I think the main conclusion is that we're leaving an enormous amount of talent out of the system. And one way to see that, for example, is if you take third grade math scores of these kids, and you take all these kids who do really well. The kids who do really well in math tend to go more into innovation careers and STEM degrees and things like that eventually. But you have all these kids who do really well in math in third grade, but don't. And the huge predictors of not doing that, not going into innovation, are household income. So if you're coming from a poor house, if you gender, race, there are many things that seem to be interfering where you have all this talent in third grade and these kids aren't migrating onto those career pathways. Another very powerful finding is exposure. You need to be around people who do innovation, your parents, your neighbors, your parents' colleagues, who kind of apparently seem to trigger the idea, oh, I could do that with my life. If you're kind of not exposed to those careers in your social network, these kids don't seem to migrate into those opportunities. So I think there's lots of points of intervention. That's more of a long run play for the economy because it takes a long time to, build all these kids over time. But whether it's individual opportunity for these kids or it's our entire sort of innovation engine, it's too bad because we're leaving so much out that we could bring in.
This is a little bit more of a personal question, but because you are also an educator yourself, has this kind of knowing this and thinking about this changed the way that you teach students here at Kellogg?
Well, sure. I try to, give people the facts so they can optimize correctly. I think, with Kellogg, we're selecting on people who are already very, very successful and are going on to successful places. And I think our students can, have the world at their feet in many ways. But I've also, it certainly has been affecting my research in the sense that I'm trying to now better understand. So what would be the levers more specifically if you were to encourage more people into these careers? How do we do that? So, one thing we have at Northwestern is all these undergraduate research programs, for example. So I'm beginning a study, can we understand when those are effective or not in terms of getting students, especially from underrepresented groups, into these pathways. And so there's I think there's a lot to be revealed, but there's a lot of, I think, potentially very scalable solutions that could really relieve the obstacles that are at the heart of this problem.
So I wanted to make sure we got to some audience Q&A. A really popular question has been about trends of innovation in emerging markets. So you've obviously talked a lot about innovation in the US and a lot of the policies and how that impacts innovation in the US. Have you looked at other countries? What can you tell us about the trends that you're seeing?
So I would say, first of all, it's a great question. I do a lot of work on emerging markets. I think the way to if you talk to a development economist, it's like you see a series of challenges, right? It's like, oh, well, there's no financial markets and there's weak schooling and there's no public infrastructure and there's governance issues with corruption and things. And you think all these challenges and they get in the way. But if you're an innovator, a challenge is an opportunity. Because what is a challenge is a problem that you identify carefully so you can figure out how to solve it. And I think if you flip that, it gets you in a more optimistic point of view, but it also gets you to actual concrete solutions. And so I think we've seen, go back to CellTel in building a mobile telecommunications across sub-Saharan Africa. People said it couldn't be done and they succeeded because they understood exactly the challenge and they saw it was a huge opportunity and they figured out how to solve for it. And now we're seeing, on the basis of all that mobile infrastructure, enormous range of digital innovation coming from emerging markets. Of course, mobile money is perhaps the most famous, going back to M-Pesa and others, where people begin to understand local challenges and say, well, we don't have financial markets, so we're in the U.S. You have mobile phones, but you already had your bank, so it wasn't like that big of a change. But now it's like, wait a second, I had no banking, and now I have a phone, so maybe I can have banking too, for people who never had that before. And so I think there's sort of enormous innovative opportunities with creative thinking. That's not to say they don't remain all those governance challenges. I mean, it's hard. Entrepreneurship is going to fail most of the time everywhere. And emerging markets bring in, infrastructure and governance challenges that add on top of some of those risks. But the problems are so important. And the opportunity for solutions is great. And so I think it's actually a very exciting time for innovation in emerging markets, particularly in the digital arena.
We have had a number of questions about corporate innovation centers. Is this something that you've looked at or have ever investigated in any form? What these kind of centers do well or not do well?
So that's a big area of study, but it's not one that I think has been decoded through very systematic evidence. But I mean, certainly many corporations get wrong-footed. They're committed to an existing set of technologies or perspectives. They have a set of interest in the organization that maybe would be disrupted by some new approach. And so it can be very challenging for existing organizations to be highly innovative. They're also worried about their brand, whereas, which is established, whereas, a new venture can kind of fail at lower consequence, if you will. There's also interesting questions about how you incentivize people in a big organization. In a small business, you get equity and you win the pie when you win. In a big business, that's harder to do. So, I think there's a whole series of interesting questions there, which we could talk about, but I don't know that there's systematically good answers. One thing I think there is more of a systematic answer, and we haven't gotten to, is just teams. Obviously, we've talked about, maybe you don't want all young people you don't want to just not invest in young people. You don't want to say hire only young people thinking that's their ticket to future innovation. You want to hire people who are experienced in the problems that you think you need to solve, which is often much older people. The team aspect, though, is also critical. We've seen a huge systematic shift across all forms of innovation away from solo individuals, or the singular genius sort of doing it by themselves, to teamwork is driving all of the big breakthroughs. So people just don't do it anymore. They used to in many fields. The big breakthroughs were coming from solo individuals. You had a higher probability of a home run doing it alone than in a team. Teams seem to maybe slow you down. Now it's completely the reverse. It's all teams have a much higher probability of home runs. So you want to be doing things in teams. And the last point I would make there with systematic evidence is that we're learning that teams are kind of like string quartets in innovation, which is to say, if one player is out playing off key, it ruins the whole effect. Right? So there's kind of a weak link thing going on in innovation teams. You don't want to just take your best people and spread them around thinking that they're going to drive these great teams. The reality is that you seem to want to put your best people together, or maybe you only want to hire very, very good people, which means you have to spend quite a bit and compensate them accordingly. But it seems like the real angle is in teams, and in teams of putting A's, with bringing complementary specialist knowledge together, and that seems to be the higher probability ticket to success.
This sort of seems to tie back to what you were saying earlier about it just taking longer and longer to develop the expertise to kind of be in the leading edge. And that is maybe why you're seeing the need to have teams if you want to actually progress. Is that kind of how you see it?
Correct. Nobody's an expert in electrical engineering anymore, or biology. You're expert in something very, very, very narrow within it. But to tackle big problems, you can't just be very narrow. You need to have, a wide set of expertise. And so we're seeing, very, very large teams that are aggregating that kind of frontier level knowledge, not just technical knowledge, but also market sort of knowledge about customers and institutions, and kind of be trying to build that group human capital. Does seem to be essential. And that's really the right way to think about it at this point.
So we had a follow-up question on the immigration study. Do you know of any research, anyone who has studied second generation immigrants? Is that maybe a future project on the horizon?
So we're still trying to figure out if we can do that. You have to get social security records, birth records that connect parents to children. And then there's a lot of privacy issues, as you can imagine, with all this data. So things move slowly in a bureaucratic sense, but I think appropriately slowly for those privacy reasons. So yes, I mean, you can tell, let's see, Steve Jobs' father was from Syria. Jeff Bezos, parent from Cuba, right? So I mean, the second generation, you see very successful second generation entrepreneurs, and that is, I think, a very important kind of follow-on effect that immigration might have. And in fact, of course, we were finding immigrants create more jobs just in the first generation than they take. So maybe there's even a bigger effect when you look through across generations. But something we'd like to do, but I don't think we have systematic evidence on that one just yet.
We've also had some follow-up questions on your study on R&D spending, and we've had some questions about, can you talk about any differences between like corporate R&D spending and what might happen, let's say at like a university or some sort of research center?
Yeah, it's a great question. You might think, well, maybe it's the corporate R&D that matters a lot, or maybe it doesn't matter very much, or maybe it's the basic research that matters a lot. And this is a hard question, and partly because they're very entangled with each other, because one can sort of feed to the other. And so we don't know. I think the studies about the R&D tax credit tell us that there's opportunity left on the table in the private sector, because you increase that and you get a lot more innovative benefit. And I think the studies of things like the NIH about drug development say there's a lot more left on the table for basic research too. So given the current state of knowledge, I would say let's just do more of both. But the entanglement's very interesting. I mean, take something very concrete like Uber. We ride around in Uber or Lyft, right? That doesn't work unless you have GPS, right? You need to know where the driver is, and the driver needs to know where you are. Okay, so you need GPS, but GPS doesn't work unless you correct it's a complicated thing with clocks, how GPS works, but you have to correct the clocks for Einstein, for general relativity and special relativity, right? So actually Uber depends on Einstein in a way people don't appreciate. And moreover, Einstein couldn't solve his math back in the early 20th century in 1916. In order to solve it, he had to rely on Bernard Riemann's work from the 1850s, and that unlocked the door to general relativity. So, it's all very entangled. We do think that basic research, ultimately, these new understandings open doors. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. But that's why I think separating them is challenging. Great question for the researchers among us trying to figure it out. But I think in the meantime, we think that, I would say life is uncertain. We don't have to have full certainty. Let's just invest in all these different directions because there's evidence that it could all help.
An interesting follow-up question. I think probably about your study on that top 1 in 1,000 successful companies. Did you notice anything else interesting or notable about this group other than the age of the founders? Like once you've got this body of awesome companies, did you dig in a little bit further, and what can you tell us, if anything?
Yeah, I'll tell you a few things, and there's so much more to know. One thing is that they often are in somewhat bigger teams to start. So it goes back to that team point. It's not just the solo founder, or not even two, maybe it's 3 or 4 people. The second thing is that these are people who are actually very successful in the labor market. So if you say, okay, we can trace every founder back into their prior employment, and we know what their wages were. It's the people who start the most successful companies were getting very, very well paid in the private sector. So these are. It's not like, oh, the private sector didn't work for me as a worker, I'm going to start a company instead. And of course, that may happen. These are all patterns. They're not like, they're exceptions. But on average, it's the people who start the highest growth companies were in the exceptionally upper tail, doing very well in the labor market as well. So that's a couple of other kinds of insights. We're actually integrating a much bigger set of census information that will give us much more detail about people's backgrounds as we speak.
Yeah, what are you going to be looking for in their backgrounds? It sounds really interesting.
Well, immigration, by the way, is another one. Immigrants start high growth firms. Educational background of the parents, trying to decode some of the mechanisms that are at work here. But I want to add one more nuance, because we say old or young. I think it's also reflective of the kinds of problems you understand and therefore know how to successfully solve, right? So I think when you think about the very young entrepreneurs, they're typically doing something that's relevant to their social group, like social media, or something some problem they understand. I often joke it's not even B2C. So we say B2B, B2C, it's B2Me. It's like, it's a problem because it's a problem you have and you understand. I want to get my dry clean delivered to my house. Okay, that's B2Me. I've got at least one beta customer because that's what I want. So I'll start the company. So there's a bit of that. But then, as you get older, more B2B and more deep tech and scientific type things that are, or cancer or biotech or clean energy. Now we're talking people who kind of are going to understand those problems and potential solutions because they're deeply invested in that technology space. And then it might be, the reinsurance industry. It might be something much more market knowledge based because you've been working in that industry and you really understand what the challenges and problems are that could really make a big difference if you could solve them. So I think, we're going to see a wide range of ages. And I think the thing to ask yourself is not, am I old enough or young enough? It turns out you can do things at great ages. I mean, we have tons of successful entrepreneurs in their 50s and 60s too, and in their 20s. So the question is, am I ready? But it's because do I understand something that most people don't, and do I have the requisite skills to execute against that? I mean, that's sort of the question you're trying to ask. And that's probably the set of challenges you're going to understand are going to evolve as you evolve in your career and in your life.
I think we probably have time for maybe 2 more questions. I wanted to ask, so you mentioned earlier that 2.7%. That is the amount of our GDP that goes toward R&D. How does that compare internationally? Is the US doing more? Is the US doing less? Is that something that you've looked at?
Oh yeah, we tend to do more. Historically, we did a lot more. We've kind of held that steady over a long period of time. The federal component's been declining. The private sector component's been going up. Many countries, other advanced economies in Europe, et cetera, Japan, or et cetera, they kind of look at the U.S. innovation and engine and say, well, they're really good at that compared to us, so we should do more. And so over time, we've seen a lot of European countries step up towards U.S. levels. And now, like a Germany or a Japan might do somewhat more than we do, maybe 3%. But everywhere people do basically too little from the perspective we've talked about.
All right, well, I want to end with, I loved your advice about kind of if you have that piece of information that you are the leader in, and maybe this is, don't let age or any other reason be the reason why you don't start your company. So I just wanted to end with maybe if you had a recommendation, maybe a blog or a podcast or a book about innovation that you would really recommend to somebody who's interested in kind of diving in deeper and maybe starting their own company?
Well, that's a great question. In fact, I'm thinking about writing a book. So if you have thoughts of what you'd like to hear about, I heard some today. And in fact, feel free to email me. I would value that. This is the kind of thing I really want to know the answer to, because I'm shaping a narrative around a lot of these findings and others now. But in terms of books that already exist, I mean, be a little careful. I mean, I think it's a lot of things are sort of shoot from the hip, sort of here's my experience, and they may not generalize. But if you want a book I kind of like, for example, Safi Bakal's book Loon Shots. Some people asked about sort of how corporations can sort of succeed, and he's thinking about why did Polaroid sort of just miss digital photography? These kinds of questions. And I think if you're interested in that kind of a question, I know him. He's very thoughtful, and I think he's saying things that are very plausible. And I think it's a well-written book. So Loon Shots, Loon Shots.
Well, thank you so much. We are at time, but I want to thank Professor Ben Jones for joining us for an hour on innovation. Always a pleasure to chat with you. And I wanted to thank everybody who has been here listening in and sending in really great, thoughtful questions. As a reminder, we will be sending out a link to a video of this presentation after the fact. If you did opt to subscribe to Kellogg Insight when you registered, we'll be adding you to our mailing list this week. And if you didn't, but want to hear from us, be sure to head over to Kellogg Insight to subscribe. And we hope to see you back next month, January. That's Thursday, January 21st at noon, to learn all about designing compelling data visualizations with Professor Steve Francaneri. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your holidays.